Okay, hello everybody. So if you were here just before I started recording, you know that Karthik and I were talking about our research. Um, it's interesting because one of the things that people don't always think about when they're an undergrad is that, you know, schooling doesn't necessarily have to end at the end of your fourth year. And I know that on the U of T side, as well, at least in the computer science, this is a fourth year course, which means a lot of people are actually graduating at the end of this. And you know, some people have aspirations to go into industry, you know, particularly the game industry, and you know, we're going to try to do what we can to help with that. But for some of you, you see this as an opportunity to kind of go to the next level, which is to like go into schooling that's more directed by you, right? Like grad school is just the idea that instead of taking courses, you know, to fulfill some degree requirements, um, we have a whole wealth of knowledge that we can share. That's, you know, by people in the faculty, the kind of research that they're working on, you know, the things that are more cutting edge, the things where, you know, it's so specialized that you wouldn't necessarily have like a 100-person class around it. And so this is grad school, right? And you can either go into your master's, in which case you get a chance to dabble a little bit in what research is like and see some of the things that go beyond what your four-year undergrad can show you. Or you can go further and do your PhD, in which case you are not only learning about some of this cutting edge research, but you're contributing to it. The idea at the end of the PhD is that you're meant to be like an expert in the field, enough to be able to take the state of the art and nudge it a little bit farther forward. So that's kind of where Karthik and I are right now. Like I just finished mine less than a year ago, and mine was on the area of educational video game design. So I'll be talking a little bit about that later in the course to be able to give you a sense of, you know, where things could go in that direction and some of the other video game research I worked on. But to share with you today is Karthik, who's going to show his perspective on like research and, you know, particular like video game research as it intersects with human-computer interaction. And so why are we showing you this stuff? Because it's one thing to be able to make games, right? Like the basic thrust of this course is to teach you how games can be made and try to help mentor you in the creation of something of your own. But we're here to show you that the field is constantly growing and expanding and you know, being pushed forward by people who are looking to kind of develop like the next new thing in games. And so we want to give you a little glimpse into that so that you can kind of see both, you know, what kind of things Karthik and I work on outside of these class interactions, and also to give you some ideas as to what things you might be able to do yourself. If you are still going to be with us, you can take part in things like a 494 course where you can actually do some of these kinds of researchy things yourself. So if we give you a chance to see some of this and think a little bit about what you would be capable of doing, then that's basically what this hour is meant to be. All right. So anyway, that's the idea of what we're trying to show you here today. And with that, I will hand things over to Karthik. So each of us is going to show at different points in the course a little bit of what game design research can be like, starting with Karthik. Karthik, do you want to give yourself a bit of an intro and then?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Karthik. I'm your TA for this course, and I'm also a PhD student in the computer science department. And my research focuses on human-robot interaction, which is a subset of human-computer interaction broadly. And the idea behind my research is to look at ways in which we can enhance the interaction of humans when they're working alongside or working with robots. And so I'm kind of in my, let's say in the middle of my PhD, so I still have a couple of years left. And yeah, I was really excited to present today, slightly different topic than my research area. But this is about, so what I'm going to present today is about this conference called Kai Play, which is a conference about game research. And it's kind of a conference that intersects a few different areas. So areas like play, games, and human-computer interaction, which is kind of my area of research. So there's all sorts of topics that are kind of in this conference, and this is a yearly conference, and these span all the way from conventional video game research to things like applied games research. So, for example, for education, like Steve mentioned before, or for extra games, or for physical or mental health. So today I'd like to kind of provide a few different papers that I found really interesting in the last couple of years of Kai Play, the conference. The first one I'm going to cover is about this idea of predicting game difficulty and churn. So one of the challenges in designing games is predicting player experience and behavior, because you need to, let's say you design a level or you're designing a game. Eventually, you have to bring it to people and have them experience it in order to improve your game, right? However, testing is a challenging experience because one, it's slow because you have to recruit real people to play, and two, it's expensive, and three, which is something that's also important, is collecting and analyzing this data is super hard. So oftentimes when you come up with a game or come up with mechanics, in practice, when players play these games, they come up with novel ways to leverage these mechanics. So for one example would be something like Team Fortress 2, where people use rocket jumping as a way of navigation. So the idea behind this project was, what if we could come up with a simulation model to predict pass and churn? And they wanted to leverage some of the state-of-the-art research in deep reinforcement learning in order to assist with that. So what did they actually do? Essentially, they took data from this game called Angry Birds Dream Blast, and they already had access to this data, which consists of pass and churn rates for each level of this game across almost 100,000 players and over 100 levels. And the idea is that pass rate is typically it's the percentage of how many times does it take for an average player in order to pass the level, and churn is the probability of players not returning after 7 days. And these are very important metrics that are commonly used in video games when development, because of course, if you're designing games, especially today, microtransactions and kind of incremental purchases are a common way to make money over a game's lifespan. And so making sure that people are actually playing your game over time is very important. So what did they try to do? So essentially, they wanted to train this model and compare its performance to these, this data that they already have available to them. And so essentially what they did is they trained a deep reinforcement learning agent to play this game. And then they tried to figure out whether this could actually be a predictor of player performance. So their model is, I'm not going to get into the technical details, but essentially their model uses a specific algorithm called PPO, which is an on-policy algorithm. And essentially what they did is that they had observations of the game coming in from things like screenshots, and specific data about the game. So for example, how many moves remain, how much time is elapsed, and so on and so forth. And essentially their agent is learning to predict where to be on the screen at any given moment. And so they discretize this into this 32 by 32 grid. And the goal was this agent is supposed to predict that space or that next action. And it collects rewards, of course, by progressing in the game. So they kind of combine extrinsic rewards, which are things like how much progress have I made towards the game, as well as something called intrinsic reward, which comes from this specific model that researchers have come up with to make some of these agents have this notion of curiosity, which humans have. So what they found is that once they trained this agent by itself, it wasn't that good at predicting. So if they trained a regression model with this, so first of all, they trained this agent to play the game. And then they use the data produced by this agent in order to actually predict the pass and churn rates. And what they found is that by itself, it's not the best. It doesn't actually perform like the real data does. And in this case, as I mentioned, they have the real data. And one of the problems that they found is that it typically, because this agent is trained on its own, it doesn't really account for things like player experience from actually playing the game over time, their skill, or even their personality. So some people, for instance, have more resilience and they're willing to play games even if they're frustrating, for example, whereas other people will give up much faster. So eventually what they did is that they figured that maybe we can use a combination of the kind of models that they have available. So first, what if we could take the output of whatever this agent is, or what if our our baseline predictor is, which is in the previous page, and what if we could normalize this and then actually apply this model, this very simple model, which they call the pass and churn simulation model. And what they're doing here is essentially they're taking data from their game, which I mentioned at the start, and they took this data about pass and churn, and they combined this with their predictor. And what they found is that once you do that, if you combine some of these characteristics of the population, so naturally players will kind of stop playing your game over time. So let's say at level 1, there's 100 players. at level 10, maybe there's 50 players. By accounting for this model, they're able to produce, eventually a model that kind of closely mirrors what real player data looks like. So what does this actually tell us? This tells us that potentially models like these can help us potentially reduce the need for human testers. So maybe you don't need them as early on in the process, but one of the caveats of this kind of work is that eventually they had to use, some model of the player population, whether it comes from that same game or, genres of games is a different matter, but eventually they had to use a combination of these two to predict what player churn or pass rates would be like. So yeah, I just wanted to maybe stop here for a minute or two if anyone has any thoughts to add to this kind of idea.
I have some thoughts.
Sure.
I was actually working on this or something like this at one point.
Oh,
where,
cool.
Yeah, because what we were trying to do is automate QA, because like the biggest thing when it comes to coming up with a research question is to try to find a pain point for the industry. And one of the things they had difficulty with was doing automated QA and QC, because it was so expensive. Like you had to get a whole team of playtesters to go in and find bugs, and you had to be able to reproduce them. And it was a pain. So we were trying to think, could we automate it by coming up with, AI that could play a level and say what kind of player type this level was more skewed towards, so we had it play like automatic death matches, and then we kind of tuned our AI to just to see what kind of player type it converged on. And yeah, I think we got to a certain point and we were like, we need real levels, we need like real data. And so we've been trying to get Ubisoft Toronto to get on board and, work with us.
Sounds really cool.
It was cool, but we were using like genetic algorithms because we just had like a vector of characteristics, that said how like aggressive we're going to be. To what point are you going to try to move around a lot versus like camp out someplace? Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it is an interesting and like it's a needed area for people to try to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another thing to note is like this game is very simplistic because all they were predicting is, screen positions, right? But as soon as your game gets slightly more complex, we don't even know if a model like this can be trained, number one, but also does it really mirror what people would do? And so I guess one of the discussion points is like, can these models actually account for those things, or do we still need human testers early on, or can we just postpone their involvement in the game development process?
Yeah. Ours only worked, I think, because we had sort of like a slightly higher level AI where it already had certain behaviors built into it, and we just need to be able to like tune those behaviors to say how much they're going to have of one behavior versus another.
Right. Yeah. Cool. So if we don't have any kind of thoughts other than this, we can move on. So the next game that I wanted to talk about is it's titled the role of partial automation and increasing the accessibility of digital games. So one of the challenges with designing games is actually you have to make assumptions for or about what people or what your players are able to do. And many games assume that players can use the input device or set of input devices that their game works on or their game requires. Sometimes there are kind of tools that you can do to repurpose or alternate controllers that you can design or they already exist that people can use to play games that require conventional controls. So for example, using maybe like a cycle, for example, to simulate movement as opposed to using a joystick. So because this is a challenging kind of problem of designing games to be accessible to broad range of abilities or people with a broad range of abilities, these researchers came up with this idea of like partial automation. So thinking about how you can leverage AI to assist with very specific pieces of the game. So for example, if you have a game in which there's 3 mechanics or 4 mechanics, what if you could automate one of those mechanics and let the player control 3 or 2 of these versus 2 for the player? And so their kind of goal was to give the player the freedom to choose which of these mechanics they wanted to automate. And they wanted to demonstrate that this could work for scenarios where you have players with different sets of abilities. So for example, if in their case, they conducted a study with 6 participants who had spinal cord injuries, and they wanted to assess whether this approach of partial automation would actually help them play the game more effectively. So for their games, they chose kind of simplistic games, but they're interesting games. So they chose this game called Dino Dash and Dozo Quest, and both of these games require or are designed to be played with a stationary bike and a gamepad, so they can use either or. And they have kind of three mechanics or three sets of controls. So the first one is if you're using the stationary bike, the paddling helps you control the speed of the character. They have a joystick, which helps to control the movement direction of the player. And then they have a single button, which maps to an action. So in the case of Dino Dash, it's dashing towards a player. So that would be considered an action with a button press. So essentially, they designed very simple AI. So they use simple heuristics to design this AI. So they weren't trying to demonstrate like state-of-the-art AI necessarily. The idea was to show partial automation. So in the first game, they have a state machine which transitions between behaviors based on surroundings. So for example, if you have a dino and there's a nearby egg and there's no players around it, then if the AI is automating that process, the action itself, then the system will trigger the dashing. And so their system was able to kind of automate any of these three mechanics, the movement, direction, or action. And it was up to the user to figure out which of these they wanted to control, or which of these two or three of these they wanted to control. And similarly with Dozo Quest, they had a slightly different approach. So they weren't using state machines, but actually instead they were using pathfinding. So the pathfinding was automated using a common algorithm called A*. It's also used in video games a lot. And the idea was that the system could automatically pick targets as enemies to kind of attack next using this A* algorithm. And this was the movement component of it. And so in both of these games, one aspect to notice is that they were trying to go over this idea of shared control, which is like, I'm controlling maybe, let's say, two mechanics, and the AI is controlling the third one. And we have to coordinate our actions so that we can eventually play the game successfully. So how did they actually evaluate the system? They conducted a study with 6 participants, 2 of whom could use all of the input devices. So they're able to pedal, they're able to use the joystick and press a button. 4 of these could not pedal the bike, and 2 of those who couldn't pedal also could not use the gamepad. So they were using a bite stick to perform the specific action of dashing, for example, and they used the joystick for movement. And then the remaining inputs were automated for all of these users. So for instance, if all of them could be applied by the player, then nothing was automated, versus if they could use only 2 of these, then 1 of these actions is automated. Cool. Whoops. Yeah, so what did they actually find? They found a couple of different things. First of all, they found that adaptation of this idea of partial automation actually helped players feel more able and focus on the important aspects of the game. So for example, in some games, there are mechanics that are kind of annoying to deal with. So for example, maybe in a game, let's say it's an open world game and it's really massive, walking around is not really fun because it gets boring over time. So one unintended kind of benefit that they found is that allowing players to choose which parts to automate actually help them enjoy and focus on the more important aspects of the game because they could kind of delegate that to the AI. However, some of these players, some of the adaptation actually meant that players felt more disabled and diminished because they felt like they couldn't do something, and that's why they had this sort of partial automation approach. And then I think the last one is kind of most interesting from an AI, like a human AI perspective or human robot perspective from my research, is that automation confused players because it was really hard to know what the system is going to do ahead of time. And so it's really hard to coordinate and share control with an AI when you're trying to play a game. Because you never really know when something's going to be triggered. You don't know to what extent your actions are influencing what the AI is going to do next. So just wanted to put some thoughts out there for discussion, which is like, how do we kind of improve the this notion of like the mental model of your partner if let's say you're playing with an AI? Because right now in their current state, in their current system, there was really no communication mechanism. The AI just takes control of one of these 3. You can tell it which one to take over, but once you've done that, there's no back and forth dialogue. It just happens. And another thing is that once you delegate control to this AI, it's basically binary, right? So if let's say that the AI is responsible for the action, let's say the dashing action, you can't really tell it when to provide this action. It's kind of fully automated. And so one question is, should we provide some control over aspects of this sort of thing so that we can mitigate some of this loss of agency or inability to play with the agent? So maybe one example is like, maybe I can provide some more information to guide the agent towards its action. So it's not completely separated from me. But overall, what they found is that partial automation is an effective way of increasing accessibility of these sort of things. So I just wanted to include this paper because it's a really interesting idea for or using an interesting way of using AI in games. So yeah, I'll stop here for a moment if anyone has thoughts again.
Any thoughts here? I mean, we will have a chance. I will be presenting something on AI in games later. Like after you've managed to get your, I think like after you've done your alpha or beta, and you're ready to start making your games more intelligent. But yeah, like these days, there's a lot of work that's being done on trying to make these games more intuitive, more interactive. In the past, it used to be that any budget that was put towards games was all just trying to make the graphics better. But now that graphics has kind of hit this upper ceiling, it's now about AI. What can we do to make these things smarter, more interactive, more natural? Yeah. So I don't know if anyone here has interest in AI. No one has. It's a pretty boring topic these days, but with very little interest. But if you are, then yeah, we can talk.
One other thought I wanted to add is although this idea was used to just demonstrate the improving accessibility for video games, you could potentially consider utilizing this in our own games, even for people who are fully able, let's say, because there might be some moments where you just want someone else to be. Maybe you're alone, maybe you're playing by yourself and you're bored. Maybe the other partner can be your kind of assistant while you play a game, or it can again automate some of the mundane aspects of a game if they exist. So it can go beyond just accessibility, I think.
Yeah, I love the game to realize that I've fallen asleep. I've fallen asleep with the controller in my hand, and make sure that I don't walk off the cliff.
Exactly. Yeah.
That would be nice.
Cool. If we don't have any other thoughts, then I'll move on to the next game. So this one is called Effects of Background Music on Risk-Taking and General Player Experience.
This is relevant to what we're doing in this course.
Yes. So let's see. I'll reduce the volume so it's not too loud. This will not make that much sense when you're watching it right away, but let's see. Okay, so they're just describing the courses right now, so I'll get into the part that actually is interesting. Yeah. Cool. I'll actually get into the details, so it'll make a little bit more sense. So the motivation behind this project is that music is prevalent everywhere, obviously, and also in games, but their potential to influence player experience and behavior is less understood or less well understood. And studying this effect, or studying whether this risk-taking behavior is affected by the presence and attributes of music is what the author's focus was in this game, or in this research paper. So as I mentioned, music is prevalent in pretty much everywhere, and it has been shown to influence things like customer purchase or duration of stay, for example, in a casino. It has been used to regulate emotions such as stress, and then there is some evidence in the research literature that music can impact performance, but it's kind of weak, I would say. So the goal of this paper was let's see if we can kind of isolate the specific aspects of music that could affect player experience or potentially player performance or risk-taking in this case. And so they designed a mixed methods user study in which players could choose between an easy, safe course versus a harder, more rewarding course in each level. So every level is split into this easy and hard track. And they manipulated the presence of music and specifically the tempo and affect of the music. And they wanted to see whether that would affect risk-taking. So they had specifically 3 questions in mind. One is, does the presence of music affect risk-taking? And then beyond that, if it does affect anything, how does music affect and tempo influence risk-taking? So how does that actually make a difference in the specific attributes of the music? How does that influence risk-taking? And also, how does affect and tempo influence player experience? So this part is kind of maybe not as relevant to the CS folks, but essentially they designed, well, they had an early preliminary study to figure out specific aspects of the music that could influence arousal, so low arousal versus high arousal music, as well as tempos of music. And they kind of settled on a few different parameters here. And in the actual study, they varied 2 aspects. So the first was music tempo, and this was varied between subjects, which means that you're recruiting 2 sets of participants to experience 2 different conditions. So one set only experiences the 80 beats per minute scenario, and the other set is kind of shown the 120 beats per minute condition. And then they also played around with sound condition, which is within subjects. So in this case, both sets of participants experience all of these conditions. So happy high arousal music, neutral low arousal music, as well as no music. And then they wanted to see a few different things. So they took measurements like post-game. They had a questionnaire that they administered at the end of the study, which asked things like affective state, immersion, enjoyment, and difficulty of the experience. So just a quick kind of screenshot showing what the easy and hard levels look like in each case. In level 1, the easy and hard look fairly similar, whereas in level 6, you can see that it's quite different. And so the idea was, of course, to see which of these paths the user is more likely to take depending on music. And what did they actually find? They found some of the things that we kind of already expect, which is that music increased the sense of immersion. However, they found some interesting things here. So for example, they noticed a mirror effect in which high arousal music actually correlates with high player arousal, which kind of makes sense. And they found that the presence of music impacted risk. So just the fact that it's there influenced risk behavior. However, they actually found an opposite effect, which is that the presence of music meant that riskier routes were taken less often. And their kind of overall finding is that if you want to immerse your player, high arousal, slow music is what you would want to go for these types of action games. And speed is actually the more important attribute when you're doing this. And one of the hypotheses that they have in this work is that when there is music, there is immersion, and so players aren't really seeking out as much risk because there's already enough immersion in the game. Whereas if there's no music, players kind of got bored, and they typically tended to choose a more riskier option to kind of enhance that immersion or sense of immersion. Okay, so what kinds of things could we actually use from this research potentially? One idea would be, maybe we could turn off music at specific moments in the game in order to increase risk taking. So let's say you want to influence player behavior, you can turn off the music at a specific point in time. And then you can also play with tempo to actually facilitate immersion. So let's say kind of playing out with your tempo at specific points where you think that immersion might be lost could help with kind of correcting that. And then the last one is low arousal music yielded better performance. So this is something that they found in their studies, that people actually did better with lower arousal music, as well as felt that they were mastering the game better. So potentially using background music to affect difficulty. So for example, in the tutorial level, maybe you keep music around because you want to get players kind of immersed and learn the game. And then you can kind of play around with the type of music in order to kind of influence the player's perceived feeling of difficulty while playing the game. Cool. So I'll stop here for any thoughts.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like the arousal and the tempo were kind of separated, but to me, it feels like the tempo should actually have an effect on arousal, right? So, I mean, I saw in one of the first slides that you showed, I think arousal was parameterized on the scale. So like B flat major was low arousal, E minor was high, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like tempo also should be a factor in arousal, right? And you also said like the two groups didn't have their tempo changed. They only had their basically scales
Yes.
changed for arousal. But doesn't that kind of introduce some sort of like bias into it? Because how do you isolate for that?
Right. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's just the difficult part of research is like how do you isolate these specific characteristics? And I think I'd have to go back to the paper to see exactly what their rationale is, but I think you're right that there is this kind of notion of bias, but I think they try to do their best to separate these two. But inevitably, I think there is some bias here because you can't really separate the two fully, I would say. Yeah.
So I was actually, part of my PhD research was looking at how, like, yeah, these design features would affect the educational aspects of a game versus the fun aspects. And yeah, it was brought up that the two things may not be mutually exclusive, although it turns out they kind of were, but whatever. But we actually, when we do these things, we often do a correlation analysis as well that shows that, you know, if we're looking at two effects, like how much do the two effects tend to correlate with each other, so that, yeah, there's no linear separability between these things, or very rarely is there.
I mean, when you say that, sorry if I can just follow up on that.
Mm-hmm.
If you say that, but how are we defining arousal here? Like,
Yep. Nope. That is another. This is actually one of the things I'm working on right now. Now that my PhD is done, it's like, what am I going to do, right? So I'm like a free agent. So right now I'm working on games, like trying to create games and measure the level of arousal and the level of anxiety that players feel. And this is the major roadblock that we're hitting. Like, how do we actually measure this thing properly? And there's all sorts of problems with the methods that people use to measure. Like this one has self-reporting as one of the things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But self-reporting is often, unreliable. So, but it's also like, well, what better measurements do we have? So we're looking into things like heart rate monitors. We're looking at like facial recognition. We're just trying to figure out like, what is the better way of trying to measure arousal in the player? So yeah, no, it's tough. It's like, I don't know, we don't have a good way. The best that I've seen so far is that, like, yeah, you look at certain facial features, and you get people to they narrate their experience as they're playing it, so that they start saying like, oh, here's what I'm doing now. Oh my God, what the, and so it helps to try to gauge how they're doing by kind of getting like a running commentary as they're playing the game.
But it may be in that scenario they feel less immersed because they're having to comment on it.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
It is really brutally tough to try to make this work well. Yeah, that's why we're trying to do the facial recognition stuff to see if we can just get it from people's faces. Even then, it's a little bit artificial because people might know they're on camera, but at least it's not as intrusive as distracting yourself by narrating what you're doing as you play.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. This is why it's tough to be an HCI researcher.
I mean,
Exactly.
Even if you do the facial recognition or the heart rate monitor,
yep,
what is arousal actually? Like, is it just being more, you know what I mean? Like,
well, what I'm looking at is anxiety. Like, we're trying to measure the anxiety level that certain educational games have on, or yeah, certainly the effects that these educational games have on player anxiety. So it's like you're playing a math game and you can't solve it, or like the timer is starting to get to the end and you're getting anxious. So like the work I'm trying to help with now is like measuring anxiety. But right now, yeah, we're basically hitting a bit of a dead end because everything we've been trying to do with facial recognition has come up dry. It's impossible to find a good way of measuring anxiety from people's facial expressions, because some people's facial expressions when they're anxious look the same as when they're neutral, right? Like if you looked up anxiety face on Google Images, you'll get these almost caricatures, right? Like people are acting almost cartoonishly anxious. But trying to measure how people actually look when they're anxious about something is turning out to be a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Anyway, that's what I'm working on now.
But arousal is excitement, right? That's
Yeah.
what it's measuring.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then even then there's different kinds, right? Is it like excitement from like your immersion? Is it excitement from like being scared, or like jump scare kind of stuff? Everyone's got a different version or like a different index for arousal. Yeah, this is part of the reason why it's so tough, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you look at this deeper, you can try to dig in and find out like what did they use to measure arousal. Like it was self-reported, but what did they actually look for to say that arousal is defined as this? And sometimes when you're doing your research, you have to make those definitions because you can't make some absolute measure of arousal. So you'll say the limitations of my scope is that I look at arousal as being this. And some people might take issue with it, but you're like, well, look, I need something. Okay, so here's what I use to measure arousal. If you don't like it, then take whatever portion of what I did, like take whatever portion you can from what I did and, see it with that grain of salt.
Mhm.
Yep.
On risk taking, I didn't understand, Karthik, the
Mhm.
how the different levels or the choices on the levels were a measure of risk taking. Do you think you could explain that?
Yeah, so sorry, let's see if I can find it in that screenshot. Yeah, so essentially every level has two paths, right? So there's an easy path and a hard path. And the player has the choice to pick between those in every single level. So there's, let's say, 6 levels, right? So at each level, you have this ability to pick the easy or the hard course. And they were using just this binary choice of easy, like left or right, as a measure of, are they taking a risk or not? Because in this harder version, it's more likely that you'll fall. And in this game, the objective was picking up like coins. And so if you fell, then you lose a life and you're kind of dead, right?
So why would they choose the harder one? Because there are more coins? Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, you're incentivized to pick up more coins in order to get a better score. But because the harder level is more likely to kill you, then you're probably less likely to pick it, right? So the idea was like, could we use the presence of music and the specific characteristics to influence that choice? Yeah, that was the idea.
I wonder if so is the hypothesis is that because people felt more immersed when the music was a certain way, they felt like they were actually there, and so they were more risk conscious. But but I wonder if the music would have a similar effect on risk taking if it wasn't in the context of a video game where the question was, do they feel like they're not there or not? Like for example, like people are like picking stocks, and like you just play music in the ears of like stock pickers or investors, and like investors that listen to music all day that is fast paced or whatnot, make riskier stock bets or stuff like that, or gambling or something like that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this could be extrapolated to other scenarios, and I think like their motivation was like the example of the casino, for example, where the type of music you play at a casino does influence people's behavior, and that's how they pick the music. And so they wanted to see if this also applies to games, but there are a lot of domains in which they're not really, this hasn't been studied. So absolutely, there's a lot of open areas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Do we have time for another paper? We do, right?
Yeah, we can do a quick.
Cool. Maybe I'll skip the one on Juicy then, because
we're going to be talking about the Juicy stuff on Tuesday.
Cool. So I have another one that's sort of interesting.
Which for people who don't know what we're talking about is probably going to be a funny comment to try to parse. Right. But yes, we will have a talk about juiciness on Tuesday.
Cool. Yeah. So this I guess this last one for now is about increasing player performance and gaming experience in high latency setups. So this is another AI paper, so hopefully people are okay with that. So the motivation behind this work is that latency is a common problem that people experience when playing games, because not everyone has a good internet connection, and even if so, server latency is also a problem. Typically in multiplayer games, but sometimes in single player games, there's other types of latency, right? So not just network latency. And latency is known to impact player experience and performance, which makes sense. If you've ever played any multiplayer games, if you have high latency, you kind of stop enjoying your game. And the idea behind this work was, what if we could predict the player's input while these kind of high latency periods are ongoing, in order to reduce that kind of issue that they face of like what happens after the latency period has expired and I need to do something. So when you're playing like a FPS, for example, once latency expires, you're kind of in this, maybe you're teleported to a new place and you don't really know what's going on. So they use this idea of artificial neural networks, which obviously now they're kind of outdated, but they're still being used for specific tasks. So in the past, ANNs have been used to predict things like user touch. So where is a user going to press on a smartphone, for example? It's also been used to improve VR motion tracking because motion tracking also has latency issues. And so you need to predict the person's kind of poses when these periods occur. And they kind of were inspired by this idea and wanted to leverage it for video games, or in this case, FPS games. And so they designed a custom game because eventually kind of augmenting or kind of augmenting an existing game is difficult. And so they created their own game in Unity, I think, where they have kind of this 3-stage approach where the first 2 stages teach you the game. So if you don't know how to play an FPS, they have these like first 2 introductory levels. And then they have this 3rd level in which you actually go and shoot enemies that spawn in these specific areas. And the game was like this zombie FPS game, essentially. And so the way that they approached this is that they took a lot of data from the player, so things like frame data, so continuous frame data. So let's say you have 30 frames per second, you're capturing information about the coordinates of the mouse, the player's position in the world itself, as well as some more discrete events, so things like when a player was fired at, or when a player fired their gun, when they were hit by an enemy, and so on and so forth. And they collected a large number of samples for this. And I think they had about 5 hours of gameplay. So they conducted a preliminary study where they invited people to come and play their game, and they recorded all this data. And then they trained, or they chose a simple architecture, which is an ANN with 4 hidden layers that are fully connected. And their idea was that what if we could predict up to 180 milliseconds ahead of time what the player's position and orientation would be. So they're only focusing on positioning the player, not shooting their gun or anything. And they chose 180 milliseconds because that's kind of the higher, or like the upper threshold for typical latencies. And they used a lot of literature to kind of figure this number out. And if you want to see the technical details of the paper, you can of course take a look, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. The idea, or the way that they evaluated their system once they trained it, is they wanted to, or this is a browser-based game, and so they're able to inject latency fairly easily. And by default, they always had 180 milliseconds of latency in this game. And they assigned participants to one of 4 conditions randomly. So this is, again, a within subjects design where players are either having 0 latency, 60 milliseconds, 120, or 180. And they collected over 2 million frames, so 30 frames per second across 96 participants playing this game for some period of time. And they wanted to see whether this approach of applying latency or applying their model to predict player position might actually improve the player's performance necessarily, maybe their performance, but also potentially their experience. And they actually found that this result held, which is pretty cool. They found that for the score that the player achieved, and the score is just a function of how many enemies they shoot, they found that the player achieves a much higher score when there is latency prediction, and it's kind of an increasing curve, which is cool. They also found that players had a positive affect, so they felt better about their performance or about the game when there is some sort of latency control. And this is a significant difference, which is indicated by this p-value at the top. So they're showing that when there is latency control, players do feel better and also they perform better. So that's a pretty interesting result, because that means that potentially we can leverage this sort of idea for video games when you have high latency. Of course, there's a lot of caveats to the type of approach because can you really do this when the game is more complex? That's the obvious challenge, which is if the game requires more mechanics or is more difficult, can you really predict these things in time, and can you actually scale it up? The other question is is it fair if your system can actually do better than a player could? So for example, if you're in high latency environments, does that give you an unfair advantage over people who actually don't have latency? Maybe that's too futuristic of an idea because we don't really have AI that can do that much better yet. And also, does it account for the skill level of the player? So let's say I'm a streamer and I'm really good at the game. Can this latency control or this approach actually maintain my skill level of the position I would have chosen versus if I was an amateur just starting out playing this game? So yeah, I'll stop here for any thoughts, if anyone has any.
For that last point, I think it'd be interesting if you could train a model specific to each player. So then it would actually take into account the skill level of the player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That would be a really cool follow-up study to see, like, yeah, how this works when you have skill levels and differences in that.
That stuff is hard. I know that for my work, it's like, oh, I had to basically just do the general study, and then assuming that it gets approved, then you can start looking at some of these, like the subsets, like people who have previous gaming experience, how does the research affect them? Like different demographics, right? Like age level, gender differences. Like there's a whole ton of stuff. Once the research community accepts the first idea as being worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of those things that we haven't really addressed, but is always kind of a specter in our in our background when we're trying to do our research, is that this all has to be peer reviewed and approved by the community of researchers as a whole. Like they have to not only see that you've done all the background research to actually know the field well enough to add something to it, and then like they look at your study, they try to take it apart, find all the holes that are possible, and by the time they get published, it's because they found it was both like well designed enough and relevant enough and interesting enough to be worth including into conference proceedings. So yeah, but the idea is once it is accepted, then you can start looking at the spin-offs. Like what happens if I look at a subgroup? What happens if I do a little tweak to the idea? What happens, and you can just like generate an infinite set of papers from whatever one study you've made. Does anyone have any last minute questions? We've got like 2 more minutes to go before our time with Karthik is done. Cool. Well, I mean, it's fine. We have a chance. Like I'll stop recording and then we can have a chance to talk a little bit more after this. So before I do stop recording, I just want to say thank you to Karthik for sharing us this glimpse into video game design research, especially from this human-computer interaction point of view. Later, when I do some of the work I've been looking at, I'll be looking at kind of another sort of snapshot of various areas as they intersect with video game design. But we'll do that sometime in another like month and a half or so. So yes, thank you very much, Karthik. Very much appreciated for what you've put together here today. And yeah, so I'm going to stop recording and we'll talk a little bit after this.